A 12-year-old boy arrives at Blackwood Reform School with nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation for stealing bread. The director assumes he's just another troubled kid from the slums. But 3 months later, when federal agents storm the facility with arrest warrants, everyone will discover that this quiet boy with watchful eyes has been building the most important case in the history of juvenile justice. And his testimony will expose a network of corruption that reaches far beyond the school's iron gates. Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Click the like button and let's begin the story. Thomas Miller was 12 years old when the judge sentenced him to 18 months at Blackwood Reform School for Boys. The crime was simple: stealing 3 loaves of bread from a bakery in downtown Philadelphia. The reality was more complicated. His mother had died from pneumonia 6 months earlier. His father, a factory worker injured in an industrial accident, couldn't work and spent his days in a haze of pain medication and despair. Thomas had 2 younger sisters, ages 7 and 9, who needed to eat. The bakery owner had pressed charges despite Thomas's explanation. The judge, overworked and indifferent, saw only another poor kid heading down the wrong path. Reform School would teach him discipline, responsibility, the value of honest work. Thomas stood silently as the sentence was read, his green eyes absorbing every detail of the courtroom. He didn't cry. He didn't protest. He simply nodded when asked if he understood. What no one in that courtroom knew was that Thomas had taught himself to read by age 4, that he had a photographic memory that could recall entire pages of text after a single reading, and that his silence wasn't submission, it was observation. Blackwood Reform School sat on 80 acres of Pennsylvania woodland, surrounded by 12-foot fences topped with barbed wire. The main building was red brick, imposing and grim, with barred windows that made it look more like a prison than a school. Director Arnold Blackwood ran the facility with military precision. A former corrections officer in his late 50s, he was a barrel-chested man with steel gray hair and eyes that constantly evaluated the boys under his control for signs of weakness or defiance. The official mission of Blackwood Reform School was rehabilitation through education and labor. Boys attended classes in the morning: basic reading, arithmetic, vocational training. Afternoons were dedicated to work assignments: farming, maintenance, laundry, kitchen duty. The reality was darker. Thomas noticed it immediately during his first week. The portions at meals were too small for growing boys doing physical labor. The dormitories were overcrowded and poorly heated. Medical care was virtually non-existent. But these were the obvious problems, the ones any visitor might notice if they looked closely. The real issues ran deeper. During his second week, Thomas witnessed Director Blackwood assigning a 15-year-old boy named Marcus to work at a textile factory 15 miles away. The boy would be gone for 3 days, the director explained, earning money to offset the cost of his care. Thomas watched Marcus leave in the back of a covered truck. When the boy returned 3 days later, he was exhausted, with burns on his hands and a haunted look in his eyes. He wouldn't talk about the factory, wouldn't meet anyone's gaze during meals. Thomas began paying attention to the work assignments. Approximately 1/3 of the boys at Blackwood were regularly sent to outside locations: factories, farms, construction sites. They returned exhausted, sometimes injured, always silent. The director called it vocational training. The boys called it something else when they thought no one was listening. In the dormitory after lights out, Thomas heard whispered conversations. Stories of 12-hour shifts with no breaks. Dangerous machinery with no safety equipment. Supervisors who threatened boys with extended sentences if they complained. Boys who tried to refuse the assignments were sent to isolation. A windowless concrete room in the basement where they spent days in total darkness. Thomas understood what he was witnessing. This wasn't a reform school. It was a labor camp that exploited children under the guise of rehabilitation. But understanding a problem and solving it were different things. Thomas was 12 years old, legally powerless, locked behind fences in a facility controlled by adults who had absolute authority over him. Any complaint he made would be dismissed as the lies of a troubled boy. Any resistance would result in punishment. So Thomas did what he did best. He watched. He listened. He remembered everything. He memorized the names of the companies where boys were sent. He noted the dates and durations of work assignments. He observed which boys were selected most frequently and which were left alone. He studied the pattern of Director Blackwood's schedule, his visitors, his phone conversations overheard through thin office walls. Thomas became a model student. Quiet, obedient, hardworking. He excelled in his classes despite the minimal instruction. He completed his work assignments without complaint. He never caused trouble. Director Blackwood noticed. Miller, the director said one morning. "You're showing real progress. Keep this up and you might earn an early release." Thomas nodded respectfully. Inside, he was cataloging the details of the director's office. He could see through the open door. The filing cabinets. The locked desk drawer. The telephone on the desk connected to outside lines. It was during his 3rd month that Thomas made the discovery that would change everything. He had been assigned to help the maintenance supervisor, Mr. Chin, repair a broken water pipe in the basement. While Mr. Chin worked on the plumbing, Thomas explored the storage areas nearby. In a forgotten corner behind stacks of old furniture, he found boxes of documents, personnel files, financial records, correspondence. Thomas opened one box and began reading. What he found made his blood run cold. The documents revealed systematic fraud spanning years. Blackwood Reform School received substantial government funding based on the number of boys enrolled and the quality of their care. But the actual money spent on the boys was a fraction of what was allocated. The rest was being diverted. Director Blackwood had created shell companies that invoiced the school for goods and services at inflated prices. Food that was never delivered. Educational supplies that didn't exist. Maintenance work that was never performed. But the most damning evidence was the contracts with local businesses. The factories and farms weren't paying the school for vocational training. They were paying for child labor. Boys who worked for pennies while the companies paid the director standard wages that he pocketed personally. The documents showed exact amounts. Names, dates, bank accounts. It was all there. Years of systematic exploitation and theft, carefully documented by the very man perpetrating the crimes. Thomas understood immediately that these documents could destroy Director Blackwood and the entire corrupt system. But he also understood the danger he was in. If the director discovered that Thomas had found this evidence, the boy would disappear into isolation, or worse. He couldn't take the documents. Their absence would be noticed. He couldn't make copies. He had no access to copying equipment. But he had his memory. Thomas spent the next hour reading through every document he could access, his photographic memory absorbing page after page of evidence. Company names, account numbers, amounts, dates, names of complicit officials. When Mr. Chin called for him, Thomas carefully returned everything exactly as he'd found it and went back to helping with the water pipe, his expression showing nothing of the storm brewing inside him. That night, Thomas lay in his bunk and mentally reviewed everything he'd seen. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was trapped inside his head. He needed a way to get this information to someone who could act on it, someone outside the corrupt local system that clearly protected Director Blackwood. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. During Sunday visitation, Thomas watched as the other boys met with family members in the common room. He had no visitors. His father was too ill to make the journey, and his sisters were too young to travel alone. But Thomas noticed something interesting. A social worker named Mrs. Eleanor Price visited regularly, checking on boys who had no family. She worked for the State Department of Child Welfare, not the school. She seemed genuinely concerned about the boys, asking real questions, taking notes. Thomas studied her carefully over several weeks. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested competence and integrity. More importantly, she asked the kinds of questions that indicated she suspected something was wrong at Blackwood. But approaching her was risky. If she reported his allegations to Director Blackwood, as protocol might require, Thomas would face immediate retaliation. He needed to be strategic. During her next visit, Thomas made sure to be nearby when she interviewed another boy. He listened to her questions, noted her reactions, evaluated her trustworthiness. Finally, during her visit in his 4th month, Thomas made his move. He waited until she was finishing her interviews for the day, gathering her paperwork near the exit. He approached her with a respectful demeanor, as if asking a simple question. "Mrs. Price," he said quietly, "may I speak with you about something important?" She looked at him with professional attention. "Of course. What's your name?" "Thomas Miller, ma'am. I've been here 4 months. How are they treating you, Thomas?" "That's what I need to talk to you about. But not here. Is there any way I could write to you privately?" Her eyes sharpened with interest. "Is something wrong?" Thomas glanced around the room. A guard stood nearby, too far to hear their conversation but close enough to notice if they talked too long. "I have information about how this facility operates," Thomas said carefully. "Very specific information about finances and outside work assignments. But I need to share it with someone who can investigate independently." Mrs. Price studied him for a long moment. She had dealt with troubled boys making accusations before, but something about Thomas's calm, intelligent manner gave her pause. "I'll give you my address," she said quietly, pulling out a business card. "You can write to me. I promise any letter you send will be treated confidentially until I can verify the information." Thomas took the card and memorized the address instantly. "Thank you, ma'am." That night, Thomas faced a new problem. All outgoing mail was screened by staff. Any letter he tried to send through official channels would be opened and read before leaving the facility. He needed another way. The solution came from an unlikely source. Marcus, the boy he'd seen return exhausted from the factory during his first weeks. Marcus had noticed Thomas's quiet intelligence and careful observation. One evening, he approached Thomas in the dormitory. "You're planning something," Marcus said quietly. "I can tell." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I want to help everyone here. But I need to get information outside without the director knowing." Marcus was silent for a moment, then made a decision. "My aunt works in the kitchen. She's not part of the corruption. She's terrified of losing her job, but she hates what happens here. I might be able to convince her to mail a letter for you." "Why would you help me?" Thomas asked. Marcus's expression darkened. "Because I've been to that textile factory 5 times. I've seen kids lose fingers in the machinery. I've seen them collapse from exhaustion. Someone needs to stop it." 2 days later, Marcus reported back. His aunt would mail one letter, but only one. After that, Thomas was on his own. Thomas spent a full day composing the letter in his mind before writing it down. It had to be perfect, comprehensive enough to trigger a real investigation, specific enough to be credible, but carefully worded to protect both himself and Mrs. Price if it was intercepted. He wrote during a night shift when he had access to paper and a pen in the classroom. The letter was 4 pages long, written in his careful handwriting, detailing everything he discovered in the basement documents. He listed company names, approximate amounts, the dates of suspicious transactions. He described the pattern of work assignments and the injuries boys sustained. He explained the filing system in the basement and exactly where investigators could find the physical evidence. He signed it simply, "A concerned student." Marcus's aunt mailed the letter the next day during her grocery run to town. Then Thomas waited. 1 week passed. Then 2. Thomas continued his routine, giving no indication that anything had changed. But inside he was counting days, wondering if Mrs. Price had received the letter, if she believed him, if she was taking action. During the 3rd week he noticed subtle changes. Director Blackwood received more phone calls than usual. State vehicles appeared in the parking lot more frequently. The director's demeanor became more irritable. Something was happening. On a Tuesday morning during Thomas's 5th month at Blackwood, everything came to a head. 3 unmarked cars pulled up to the main building just after breakfast. Men and women in professional attire emerged, carrying briefcases and badges. Mrs. Price was with them. Federal agents. Director Blackwood met them at the entrance, his face a mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide his rising panic. "I don't understand," he said loudly enough for nearby boys to hear. "We've always cooperated fully with state inspections." "This isn't a routine inspection," one of the agents replied. "We have a warrant to search the premises and seize financial records related to suspected fraud and child labor law violations." Thomas watched from the classroom window as agents spread throughout the building. He saw them enter the basement. Saw them emerge carrying boxes of documents. Within hours, the truth began to unravel. The financial records confirmed everything Thomas had described. The contracts with local businesses revealed systematic child labor exploitation. Interviews with boys, now conducted by federal agents who couldn't be intimidated, provided testimony about dangerous working conditions and deliberate neglect. Director Blackwood was arrested before sunset. The investigation expanded rapidly. The companies that had used child labor faced criminal charges. Local officials who had ignored complaints were questioned about their complicity. The entire system of juvenile justice in the region came under federal scrutiny. Mrs. Price found Thomas in the dormitory that evening. "You wrote that letter, didn't you?" she said quietly. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "How did you know all those details? Those specific account numbers and dates?" "I read the documents in the basement," Thomas said simply. "I remember what I read." She studied him with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Thomas, what you did was extraordinarily brave. But it was also dangerous. You could have been seriously hurt." "So could everyone else here," Thomas replied. "Someone had to do something." The dismantling of the corrupt system at Blackwood Reform School took several months. Director Blackwood was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and child labor law violations. He received a 15-year prison sentence. The school itself was closed permanently. All the boys were transferred to other facilities or released to family members, with the state providing support services. The investigation Thomas had triggered led to broader reforms in the juvenile justice system. New oversight mechanisms were established. Regular independent inspections became mandatory. Protections for whistleblowers, even young ones, were strengthened. Thomas's case was reviewed separately. His original conviction for stealing bread was vacated. The judge who reviewed his file noted that Thomas had been trying to feed his starving family and that his actions at Blackwood demonstrated exceptional character and intelligence. But the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. During the investigation, news of Thomas's photographic memory and analytical abilities reached Professor Elizabeth Warren, a child psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania who specialized in gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds. She visited Thomas at the temporary facility where he was staying during the transition. "Thomas," she said, "I've reviewed your case and your academic records. You have extraordinary cognitive abilities that have never been properly developed. I'd like to offer you a scholarship to a special program for gifted students." Thomas, who had learned to be cautious about promises from adults, asked careful questions. The program was legitimate, a boarding school specifically designed for intellectually exceptional children who needed both academic challenge and support services. "What about my family?" he asked. Professor Warren had anticipated this. "We have support services for families. Your father would receive proper medical care and job training. Your sisters could attend the affiliated elementary school. You could see them every weekend." For the first time since entering the courtroom 5 months earlier, Thomas allowed himself to hope. The scholarship was approved. Thomas's father, finally receiving the medical treatment and support he needed, began recovering both physically and emotionally. His sisters thrived in their new school. Thomas himself discovered what it meant to be in an environment that challenged and nurtured his abilities rather than exploiting them. He excelled in every subject, particularly law and social justice studies. 3 years after the Blackwood investigation, Thomas testified before a congressional committee examining juvenile justice reform. At 15, he was poised, articulate, and precise in his recommendations. "The problem isn't just individual bad actors like Director Blackwood," he told the committee. "The problem is a system that makes it profitable to exploit vulnerable children and makes it difficult for those children to seek help. Real reform requires changing the incentives and creating multiple avenues for accountability." The testimony was broadcast nationally. Thomas became, despite his youth, a recognized voice in juvenile justice advocacy. By the time he turned 18, Thomas had graduated from the gifted program with honors and received a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. His stated goal was clear: become a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. But he never forgot where he came from or what he'd witnessed. Thomas Miller, the poor boy who had been sent to reform school for stealing bread to feed his family, became one of the nation's most effective advocates for juvenile justice reform. He prosecuted corruption cases involving youth facilities. He testified as an expert witness. He helped draft legislation strengthening protections for children in state care. The basement documents he had memorized that day, the evidence he had carried in his mind until he could find a trustworthy adult to share it with, had been the key that unlocked not just one criminal case, but an entire movement toward reform. Director Blackwood had sent thousands of boys through his facility over the years, seeing them all as commodities to be exploited. He never imagined that one quiet 12-year-old with watchful green eyes would remember everything, wait for the right moment, and bring the entire corrupt system crashing down. The poor boy sent to reform school hadn't needed reformation. The system did, and Thomas made sure it got it.